All right, Doc, take it away. We have a couple little covers here from The Mysterious Affair at Styles.
And they are very good ones. Um, and I mean, there's so many different editions of the novel that I like the one on the left the best, just because it's sort of, there's a lot of angst in the book. Yeah. Yeah.
Hmm.
Do you want me to start with the background or what?
Yep, take it away.
Okay. So what I'm going to talk about a little bit today is the golden age of detective fiction in Britain, as well as the four queens of mystery. So in the 1860s, which is, of course, before our authors, um, the sensation novel would come to supersede, the Newgate novels, the melodramas, and the penny dreadfuls, which I think we've mentioned before, as the nation's favorite form of crime story. Now, instead of featuring sort of low lifes and you know you know and other, low life criminals and black and white passions where there was no question about how what a reader should feel, sensation novels were set in pretty ordinary domestic situations, often involving the middle class and the upper class. But one of the things that distinguished why it was called sensation is because there had to be a sense of the lurid, the eerie, the gripping. One critic wrote that ideally a sensation novel will accelerate the heart, quicken the breath, and constrict the blood vessels so the reader grows pale. And I guess the closest I can come to that now is like when one watches a horror movie, which are usually way too scary for me. Um, and by far the most prominent practitioner of this group was Wilkie Collins, who I had mentioned last week. He was the author of The Moonstone and Woman in White. And one of his contemporaries, Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu. And I first encountered both of these writers in a seminar at Middlebury called Blood and Thunder, with my favorite professor Fred Cabot. And in that, we also read Bram Stoker. So the idea is there's something the idea of the Gothic comes into a lot of the sensation novels. Today, I've read a couple of her books. Sarah Waters is kind of a practitioner, contemporary practitioner. And also at the time, or excuse me, later in the 1860s, Dorothy Sayers was writing, and her gaudy nights would fit the sensation novel description. She's also part of what is called the golden age of detective fiction, and that is fiction written between the two world wars. And the stories of the golden age were more remote from real life violence. I mean, from the kind of violence that we saw in Sherlock, um, and deliberately unsensational, which I think we see in Christie. And one writer said that it was a better fit for a nation in mourning. Edmund Wilson wrote a piece in the New Yorker in which he noted that reading writers like Agatha Christie made people feel slightly better in an ever more dangerous world, one ridden by an all pervasive feeling of guilt and by a fear of impending disaster. And these fears, the anxiety was eased by such omniscient detectives who know where to fix the real guilt and find the villains, like Hercule Poirot and Miss Marple. The attractions of these novels were and are cerebral. Christie explained that a detective story is a complete relaxation, an escape from the realities of everyday life, but it has too the tonic of a puzzle. It sharpens your wits. Now, these books don't ignore the real world, as the reminders of World War One certainly color the pages of the mysterious incident, as well as the portrayal of a troubled, declining upper class. So, one of the distinctive features of the golden age of detective fiction in Britain is the fact that its longest lasting writers were female, the four queens. And that included Christie, Sayers, Naui Marsh. Her first name is spelled Ngaio, and Marjorie Allingham, who was the creator of the character Campion, who's featured in a PBS series that I haven't watched. And I haven't read Marsh or Allingham, but I became intrigued about them and was a little surprised that my local library in Jenkintown holds about the same number of Marsh and Allingham titles as Sayers. Now, of course, there were way more Christies, not surprisingly. The only male writer of contemporary of these women who has maintained a comparatively strong following is G.K. Chesterton with his Father Brown series, and that certainly has been helped by uh, PBS and BritBox. And a sort of a last coda here, P.D. James, who was a favorite of mine, of contemporary detective writers, said to read the detective novels of these four women is to learn more about the England in which they lived and worked than most popular social histories can provide. So a lot of what I've just sort of quoted and pointed out, I mean, they're not like etched in stone. I mean, we can argue one way or the other, and they're just generalizations. But I think it's sort of important to see how these, both Christie and our next writer, Jacqueline Winspear, sort of emerge from this idea of the golden age. Okay, Ginny.
All right. Let me just, whoop, oh, shoot. Now what do I do when wait a minute, I have to go back. Go back. Went too fast. Whoops. Okay. Slide. There we go. Okay. So a little bit about Agatha Christie. First of all, I'm a huge Agatha Christie fan and always have been. Back in junior high, I used to read her novels with a notebook and write down clues and try to solve it before the end. That was like my goal, to figure
Oh
out
my
who it was.
God.
And I was such a little nerd with my book of, clues and questions about Agatha as I read through her books. So Agatha Christie has been outsold by the Bible and Shakespeare. She is the best-selling novelist of all time. She is best known for her 66 detective novels and 14 short story collections, as well as the world's longest running play, The Mousetrap, which only had a brief hiatus during COVID, and is back running again. She has sold over 1 billion books in English and over 1 billion in translation. So Agatha Mary Clarissa Miller was born on September 15th of 1890. Her father was a wealthy American called Frederick Miller, and her mother, Clara, was the Irish niece of Frederick's father's second wife, which was sort of an interesting link. She had an older brother and sister who were much older, 10, 11 years older than she was, so she was home alone. Her mother insisted on homeschooling and did not want her to read until the age of 8. However, Agatha got bored with that and taught herself to read by the age of 5. She lived in Torquay, which is a town in England that's right on the water.
It's Faulty
And
Towers country.
exactly. And she, being homeschooled, her mother told her all kinds of stories that developed her imagination. And her older sister, Madge, also was very big on telling her lots of scary stories. Her father died when she was 11, and it did cause the family lived in a lovely estate. And they did have some financial problems. So they moved to Paris, where she went to several different boarding schools. She was an accomplished pianist. And if she hadn't been so painfully shy, she could have had a career as a professional pianist. She was very talented. And then in 1910, she and her mother moved to Cairo for the debutante season, where they were having all their coming out parties. And one of the interesting things at the end of the debutante season, she got engaged to a young man with the story, like you see in all the movies today, like, we'll be engaged unless either one of us finds somebody better in the next couple of years. Like, we're not going to get married right away, but we're on the lookout for somebody better. But if things fall through, we've got each other. So then in 1912, she then met Archie Christie, and it was sort of love at first sight. It was a whirlwind. They were married in 1914, sort of right at the start of World War I. He was in the military. And so she was a wartime nurse. She had started working as a nurse during the war, and then she did that until she joined the hospital dispensary. So I'm going to come back to a little more stuff with that when I talk about the book. But moving ahead a little bit, after she published The Mysterious Affair at Styles, which was a success, she was contracted to write 5 more books. And in 1925, she then published The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, which was a huge success, one of her biggest selling mysteries. However, following that year in 1926 was a year of real problems for her. Her mother died at Ashfield, the family home. She was faced with cleaning out the family home by herself. Her husband was in the war, while she was trying to, get the house cleaned out and write novels by herself. And then, of course, being separated by distance from her husband, their relationship started falling apart with the grief. And then he fell in love with a fellow golfer friend of his and family friend, Nancy Neal. And Agatha really fell apart. And so as a result of this, Agatha got embroiled in her own mystery. So here we see the posters that were all over England. Agatha Christie went missing, and nobody knew where she was. And so her own life became a huge mystery. So one night in December, overwhelmed and with a close friend and Secretary Carlo away for the night, Agatha left her daughter. She had a daughter, Rosalind, and she left her in the care of the maids without saying where she was going. Her car was found abandoned the next morning several miles away, and a nationwide search ensued. The press and the public enjoyed various speculations as to what might have happened to her. And why no one knew for sure, it was eventually transpired that she had somehow traveled to King's Cross Station, where she took the train to Harrogate and checked into the Swan Hydropathic Hotel, now known as the Old Swan Hotel, under the name of Teresa Neal. Interesting, as her husband has now running off with Nancy Neal. Previously of South Africa, she listed her result. She was recognized by members of the hotel band, who alerted the police. When Archie Christie came to get her, she did not recognize him. She was possibly concussed and suffering from amnesia. She had no recollection of who she was. She's an intensely private person, made even more so by the hue and cry of the press. And Agatha never spoke of this time with family or friends. Never spoke of it again or anything. She disappeared. They searched for her. They found her. And so this is sort of the first part of her life as she's really hitting her stride in her success. And so next time I will talk a little bit more about the latter half of her life. Now, a little bit more about The Mysterious Affair at Styles. Okay. First of all, what happened there? Oh, go back. Sorry. Sorry. Okay. The Mysterious Affair. First of all, she wrote this book on a dare from her older sister, Madge. Her older sister said, I don't think you can write a mystery. Why don't you do this to, pick up your time and not be such a slacker? And she said, fine, I take you up on it. I'm going to write a mystery. And she does. She wrote it in 1916, but it was not published until 1920 in the United States and 1921 in the UK. She submitted it to 7 publishers before the publisher that picked it up took it. She also had during the war been working on the home front as a nurse with a voluntary aid detachment, just like Cynthia Murdoch in the book we are reading. She was also in the voluntary aid detachment, and she trained under an experienced pharmacist who actually carried a lump of curare in his pocket as it made him feel powerful. And in 1917, she completed the exam of the Worshipful Society of Apothecaries. So it was during this time she decided on the bet that she would write it, and she worked out her plot. She found her murderer, who we don't know yet, but she found them on a tram and in Torquay. And as for a detective, the inspiration from Hercule Poirot came from the thousands of Belgian refugees during the war that fled to England, and Torquay hosted a great number of those. And so the town of Torquay welcomed them. Agatha thought that a Belgian refugee, a former great Belgian policeman, would make an excellent detective for this book, and Hercule Poirot was born. She said he should be very brainy and he should have little gray cells of the mind. For the murder method, she naturally settled on poison, putting her newfound expertise from the dispensary to good use. The murderer's application of poison was so well described, in fact, that when the book was eventually published, Agatha received an unprecedented honor for a writer of fiction. She got a review in the Pharmaceutical Journal. So to finish her manuscript, she took a 2-week holiday at the Moorland Hotel at Haytor on Dartmoor, where during long walks she would enact the chapters and speak aloud as the characters. When finalized, she sent the story off to the various publishers, having them come back, each with a rejection. But in 1919, a momentous year, the end of the war, Archie had found a job in the city. They had just enough money to rent and furnish a flat in London. Later that year, she gave birth to their only daughter, Rosalind. And that was the same year the publisher, John Lane of the Bodley Head, was the one to publish her manuscript. And next time I'll reveal he actually made a change in her manuscript that changes the ending of the book from the way she wrote it. But this tells you a little bit about that. And so not only she worked in the Belgian refugees in Torquay where she lived. She worked in the voluntary aid detachment that she worked for as part of it. And then also, unfortunately, my thing here at the bottom is, wait a minute, see if we can move this. I can't read it exactly. Let me move this up a little bit. We'll do that. Come on up. There we go. And she copied just a little bit. It's about 25 pages in the book. She mentioned Sherlock Holmes. And then also when she describes the arrival of Jap from the Scotland Yard, she describes him as ferret-faced, which is the exact same description that Sherlock Holmes gave to Lestrade. So she wasn't against in trying to write her book to pick up a little things from some of the stuff she had learned early on. And then, now, come on, what is this doing? Okay, and Styles was well received by the reviewers in the UK and the US at the time. An analysis in 1990 was very positive about the novel, one of the few by Christie that's well anchored in time and place, a story that knows that what it describes and is cleverness. But it's interesting here, they say, I'm just moving things out of the way here so I can see. Christie had not mastered the cleverness throughout her first novel, as too many clues tend to cancel each other out. This was judged a difficulty which Conan Doyle never satisfactorily overcame, but which Christie would. So I thought that was an interesting quote with Sherlock last time. They felt that Conan Doyle wasn't able to overcome that. So that's a little bit about Agatha and a little bit about Mysterious Affair at Styles. And now we'll go to our discussion questions. There we go.
So we'll briefly review the questions that I included very quickly, and then I want to see if anyone wants to tackle one of them of these, or if you have something that's better, and just chime in. So anyway, the first one: how can we compare the relationship of Hastings and Poirot to that of Holmes and Watson, which goes back to those features of the detective novel that I had mentioned last week. Having the crony. What aspects of Poirot's character make him unique? It was funny. I was reading, somebody who was saying, can you imagine Poirot being like Sherlock Holmes, going through the moors, hiking through the moors, rushing over the moors? No, you can't. How does the setting in Edwardian England influence our understanding of the characters and their society? The fourth one, yeah, the fourth one is,
let's see, Worsley.
yeah, taking a couple of critiques or assessments of the book. And so anyway, the first one is the criticisms of Christie's books are long-standing and valid. Her characters are wooden, and she cannot conjure up atmospheres even while her plots and dialogue are excellent. And while her two detectives, Marple and Poirot, are memorable and lovable, they can hardly explain the remarkable popularity of her work. And I'm not asking that you agree with these, I'm just throwing them out there. And Marjorie Allingham, wrote, when the moralists cite the modern mystery novel as evidence of an unnatural love of violence in a decadent age, I wonder if it is nothing of the sort, but rather the sign of a popular instinct for order and form in a period of sudden and chaotic change. And then Worsley writes, and this is something I've already mentioned, the decades between the two world wars saw a great explosion of fictional death by the novelists of the so-called golden age of detective fiction. Their stories were ever more remote from real-life violence and true crime. In them, murders become tidy and domesticated, apparently causing little more upset than a lost cat. And does Styles conform to this description? So, who wants to tackle one of these, or come up, mention one of your own, and we'll go on from there.
I'll stop share so we can get everybody back on screen.
Okay.
There we go, so we can see everybody.
And remember, I'm not at all reluctant to cold call.
I think it's interesting that Hastings and Watson are both recovering soldiers, that they like and they bump into these world-class detectives because they're going to, recoup and rehab. I think that's kind of funny.
What other reasons do you think why the authors chose them?
Well, they're sort of silly sidekicks to keep us guessing the whole time and fully engaged and all that kind of stuff,
Mm-hmm. But why the military background?
You're reliable. Hi, this is Hillary. I don't know why I have a blackened screen and I was trying to fiddle with it.
I'm so upset with this, Hillary. It's good not to see you.
I will
You're
try harder
streaming
next
yourself on
time.
YouTube and they won't allow it over Zoom. Come on.
I was just going to say, obviously, your streaming is off.
I'm streaming myself. Yeah, I feel like they're reliable. They're reliable narrators, right? Like we know we can trust them.
Hillary, do you have a cover over your camera?
No, I thought of that too. Well, this would be embarrassing if this all of a sudden works. No,
You might
it
have what
doesn't.
I had last class, Hillary, is a Zoom account. Like are you like in through like a Zoom formal
Maybe.
account?
I can sign in through my phone if that's less annoying. So I'm like
Yeah.
embodied in a human.
I'm
I
wondering if, sorry.
Go ahead.
I was wondering if Soldier was somebody that everyone could relate to. At that point, everybody was coming back from war. Everyone had some kind of connection to it. So it was, they could either see themselves in it or someone they knew in it. And in a sense, like Watson especially, but Hastings a little bit, are kind of lost. They're looking for something. And I think it's just, coming back from war, it's hard to reacclimate. So it was inherently relatable in a probably positive, again, the reliability, the soldier kind of way.
Good.
Well, I think that Christie just took, Hastings did Watson. I think she just copied it because it's the same idea. To have the sidekick that is the narrator, and it works. So I think it works with her too.
And how would you describe the relationship between Hastings and Poirot versus Walt, Watson and Holmes?
I think Hastings has more personality, like he's more involved, he has more to say, and he pushes back a little bit more on Poirot, whereas Watson is kind of more like goofy and doofy and just there like by chance. Whereas Hastings goes and actually doesn't he go and get Poirot?
Yeah,
he
so,
does.
Yeah, so that's something.
Well, you got to be careful. You can't base Watson on the movies because Watson is not goofy. He's a professional man, and he's very professional, and he's in the books. He's completely different than Nigel Bruce or some of these other people.
I haven't seen the movies.
Who played him in the movies? No, I'm just saying it's.
but if you compare Hastings to Watson, just in the literature, I think Hastings is he's one whom a reader can identify with more easily. I mean, he has his goofy sides. Watson usually is, not that he always is, but he is in awe of Sherlock Holmes, whereas even though he may be wrong, Hastings kind of, he has problems, and I think we also, with him, he feels kind of second fiddle, and he's sort of like, he feels like, geez, well, why doesn't Poirot give me any credit? So I don't know. I find him more likable, and if I want to use the old literature class kind of comparison, I find that Hastings, even though he's not like an uber developed character, is a rounder character than is Watson. But I'd probably also say the same thing about Poirot and Holmes.
But I also think too, Hastings, he's constantly thinking that Poirot doesn't know what he's doing and he's past his prime. Well, he's missed the boat here. He's gotten so old and he doesn't know. And it's similar when they bring in Jap and Summerhay, and Summerhay can't, there's nothing. This man's an idiot. Poirot has no idea what he's doing. And it's very similar to the Holmes thing. They can't figure out, this man's mind is working way beyond where they are. And they don't want to, they can't acknowledge that they could possibly be wrong. And Hastings is sort of in the Summerhay crew of, I see this plain as day. How does Poirot not see this? And it's great because it makes it feel like we don't feel so stupid because we can't figure it out either. We don't know what he's seen or what he knows that makes him already have an idea of what's happened or, what's not happened. And you're just trying to help him find those clues.
And I think in many ways, both Watson and Hastings represent us.
Mm-hmm.
We're not as smart as Holmes. We're not as smart as Poirot. We're more like them. And that really, that is so engaging to a reader because, we don't want to feel stupid. It's like, we want to say, why the hell can't I figure this out? You want to have some sense of, where you enjoy the fact that you're just not as smart as others.
It's like their questions are questions that you want to ask, but you didn't think to ask them. And so they ask it for you.
Yeah. Other thoughts about that? Anybody have another question you'd like to ask? A brilliant observation that you've been holding?
I just feel, now that I'm visible, I would like to, I would just like to say that I am slightly offended at everyone ragging on Agatha Christie because I think that her story carries a lot of like, I don't think you need as much atmosphere, or you don't need as much, you know, like the character development if your story is really good. And I think a lot of her stories just stand so well on their own that I don't know, I'm kind of offended by those reviews.
I'm right with
Also
you,
think
Hillary. I'm right with you.
thank you,
I don't
Jenny.
find her characters wooden at all.
I
think
either. Thank you.
And
I
that's
think
why I
they're
included
great
them.
and they're interesting. You go to this country house. I mean, the first chapter of the book, you meet like 10 people that are all, running around in this country house. Everybody has something interesting about them that makes them unique and different. And you're, right away you're thinking to yourself, which one of these people could be a murderer? So already you're giving some depth to their character because somebody here's got something going on that we need to find out about.
And I would venture to say that like Sherlock Holmes is a little annoying sometimes. Like he's just so male and his like know-it-allness. And I admit I didn't read that whole book, so take that as you will.
He is more know-it-all. I think when Poirot in this one gets so upset when he realizes that the will's been taken or the papers were taken out of the box, and he's like goes frantic and cuckoo over what happened. He makes him a little Holmes. I couldn't see Holmes ever doing that, but Poirot was like, oh, what could I have done here? I didn't guard this and take it with me. He can make a mistake, whereas you feel like Holmes never wants to make a mistake.
I feel like this particular book is much more Clue. So now I'm like, this is much more like events unraveling and unrolling as you read it, rather than where Holmes is like almost after the fact, more of that like punch aha moment. But this is more, I can piece it together myself. I don't know if Watson is so much of a bumbling idiot as he's more of a cheerleader than Hastings seems to have his own mind. And, Hastings is kind of putting things together himself. Whereas Watson, to me, for Holmes is kind of like his ultimate champion. Like, by Jove, you're the most brilliant guy of all time, rather than sort of putting together his own thoughts.
I agree with that. And I feel like maybe he's not an idiot, and this is definitely an oversimplification, but just like how incredulous he is all the time, like it does get a little one note after a while. And I think Hastings' like intelligence and kind of going back and forth, like, oh, he's lucky he has me by his side, or like those kinds of things, it makes for something less repetitive and more interesting, for a more interesting dynamic for us to observe.
The Watson-Holmes relationship started new in the book. This one, they knew each other, or he knew of him before. And it's not really clear how much he knew or why he knew the story about Poirot. Any background on that?
They were acquainted back, they'd involved work cases when Poirot was working in Belgium before the war. So Hastings had, been over there and had been part of that. And I think that gets revealed as they go along in more books. But they did know each other from his great career in Belgium as a detective, the same way Japp knew him, and that they worked on some cases when they had some international criminals. He was also aware of Poirot and had worked with him in the past, lending him to, believe him when Poirot said, don't arrest Inglethorpe. He's not your guy, when the whole town is ready to tar and feather this guy.
I think also there's that element, of the golden, the golden age and the unsensationalistic qualities. And there's a kind of, and I've always felt this way, and, it's not like I'm right. I mean, what the hell do I know? But there's a kind of warmth in the relationship between Poirot and Hastings that I've never, and I've read all this, at one point or other, the Sherlock Holmes, there's not the same kind of warmth. And I think, like what Hillary was saying, there is a real attraction in us to the warmth between those characters. Whereas, and I think that that's something that certainly has added to the great popularity of Christie, because indeed, if one looks just from the popular standpoint, she is more popular than Conan Doyle.
by a landslide.
Poirot is almost has like a paternal aspect to Hastings. I mean,
Yeah.
mon ami, he says it all the time, and that sort of
Yes,
struck me
yeah.
out of the just when I'm reading. I'm like, wow, he's really like he really is endeared by this guy big time.
Yeah.
Calls him mon ami all the time. Not that, and it doesn't sound like it's just sort of a cordial, courtesy thing. It sounds like he really respects him, I think.
I think it's interesting too. I'd be curious what people thought about the fact that Mrs. Inglethorpe, formerly Mrs. Cavendish, being murdered, that nobody really cared that she died. Like, no. I mean, only Evie Howard was the only one that actually shed some tears. And it's sort of, I thought it was an interesting choice to have somebody murdered and nobody was falling apart, not her children, not the people in the house. What did you think of that? I thought that was sort of an interesting way to go.
I think they figured they were going to lose all the money. It was going to go to Inglethorpe.
Right. They were much more concerned. But I mean, why did they choose not to have anybody be, really crying over her except for Howard?
I think as the reader, that's probably like the ultimate admission of guilt, like right out of the box, or at least a differentiator of who's at play. If you had something like that was like a black mark, maybe.
But it's kind of almost sort of like, backwards in a way, which I really think is cool because, we could suspect a number of people, beyond Inglethorpe, for a different reason that, like, what if they all were like undone? I mean, he's the one who was most undone visibly of all of them. So what does Christie do? She makes none of them care.
Right.
Right? I mean, instead of having all of them care, becoming suspects, she says, well, she's dead. Not so good for us. Not so good for us, financially.
Including her husband. Her husband didn't really care that she died either. When the husband found out that she was dead, it was like, oh, what happened to her? It's like,
well, he was a little more, when he was in a public kind of venue, he would get a little bit more emotional. But it seems like the kids are like, it's almost like, good riddance to bad rubbish.
Money, right?
Well, that's that full suspension of disbelief where if everybody melted down, we wouldn't have a book.
Yes.
I mean, come on, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
but you could have had everybody be sad and have to guess between them instead of everybody not be sad. That's like the choice you made. Like,
why are they? Yeah.
Like everybody could have been, you would expect everybody sobbing the most so they wouldn't be suspected of being a murderer. And in this case, you suspect them all of being murderers because nobody cares.
Yeah.
Right.
I think that's a pretty good trick on her part.
Yeah. And I think it was an interesting choice of the way to go of, presenting the family to everybody is like, nobody really cares. This woman's gone. Isn't this too bad? And what's happened with the will? What did she write?
Oh, weren't they stepchildren though? I thought there was some point in the book where they said there were no actual blood relatives, which made it a little less cold.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
But they were happy to take her money and live in her house. So but you're right. You are absolutely right, Elizabeth, that she was not blood related to them.
Yeah.
Is there some kind of like class indictment going on? Like, I don't know much about like the social messages in the book and Christie's novels, but it almost like feels there's a bit of a class differentiation, clash commentary where you're going into this house that's not okay, like clearly has seen better days. Like everything feels like it's all seen better days. And I'm wondering how much of that is like the declining upper class from that period between the wars and I don't know.
Rachel, you're getting a table slap for that particular question.
That's a good thing. It's a good thing.
Good thing.
It's been a long time. Sorry.
I know it's not like Mattern, which is like it's a bad thing. With me, it's a good thing. So I think that what a great observation. What do the rest of you have to say about that?
I think
Rachel, sorry.
The whole Edwardian period, right? The Edwardian era. So I didn't know what that was because I always have been horrible at history. Sorry to tell you.
You can't know everything.
And they'll be here next week. Don't say that then, okay?
So the Edwardian era was like lavish and, you know, everything was great in the US and the UK. So this story, and this rich lady, right? So like people are fascinated with rich people and rich lives. And so this woman, she, you know, everyone's talking about her money, and this person is with her for her money, and the kids all want their money, and who's the heir. But and then the one lady kind of is her friend, Cynthia or Hayward, Haywood. So like she's the only one who kind of cares, and that's that whole apathy kind of towards her death. Like nobody really cares. They're all kind of feeding off of her, and it also kind of makes you not feel so bad for her passing. You know, you're just like, well, she was just some rich lady who was cold to everyone and nobody liked her.
You know, it's sort of like I mean, when I read about that place, not that it's as exorbitant or anything, but it's sort of like Styles is the anti-Downton Abbey.
Mhm.
You know, it's like, you know, I love the people in Downton Abbey. I couldn't give a damn about any of these characters, right? I mean, it's like, because I mean, and I think Christie is really good at making us not really care about them, because of it reflects a certain element of the age, and you know, the upper class. I mean, think who is not in the upper class in this book, or like middle upper.
Dorcas.
Dorcas, yeah.
Dorcas.
Okay. Okay. Who else?
Cynthia. Oh,
Cynthia.
Yeah. Who else?
The
Is it
gardeners.
Evelyn?
The guard. You know, the gardeners.
Right, Evelyn, you're right.
Evelyn,
Evelyn's
yeah.
works for her.
Well, the
So,
Very
you know,
good.
she sent her packing.
Okay. The pharmacist.
Right.
Right.
That's
So,
strychnine.
but think of all of them. So, I mean, they're you know, they're this, you know, sort of the secondary cast. But how do they operate compared, or how do we feel about them? How do we interpret them versus the main characters? And I put aside, no, I'm not talking about Hastings or Poirot, although you could say that, well, Hastings is part of that Edwardian hierarchy.
If we don't like them, we don't care if they're found guilty.
Okay.
We're happy to look at, I think we're happy to look at them as suspects because
Right.
we don't like them. But I also, you know, I think it's interesting that Poirot cares very much about Mrs. Inglethorpe because she was responsible for helping the Belgian refugees. And
Yes.
that's
Yes.
his goal, to solve this murder for her, because she did so much for him and his fellow Belgian refugees that were living in the town. So he has a nice connection with her, as Evelyn Howard is the only other one who has a really nice connection with her, that, you know, cares about her, you know, and warned Hastings to look after, you know, that somebody was going to try to take advantage of her and he should have looked out for her. And of course, Hastings, you know, thought she was just talking to, you know, out of her hat.
And to us as readers, how much do those, you know, secondary characters who clearly are of a different stripe and a different class, how do we perceive them in relationship to the others?
They all worked. They had a job.
Much more likable, yeah.
They're working
Very
people.
important. They all work. That in and of themselves, I mean, it's interesting. Is you know, that one statement where you know, that states that Christie doesn't create enough atmosphere, I think is, you know, BS in some respects, because yeah, we see the operations of this particular element of British society.
Yes.
And well, yeah, well, we kind of like the working people, but why else do we like those particular characters? Why else do we like them? I mean, we know why we don't like the others, but you know, she's drawing. I mean, she has a lot of characters who are from, you know, quote unquote, the lower class. Why is that? What is she trying to get at in presenting the whole mystery with those kinds of characters?
Well, I do think they're the truth tellers, and at least there's
You gotta
no motive ascribed to them to, well, to commit murder, but also to be deceptive, which is in contrast to all the family members, certainly.
That's really interesting because I was trying to pull up some quotes because I was reading, there was something on page 63 where they're talking to one of the gardeners, and it says, his back was much bent, though he was probably not as old as he looked, but his eyes were sharp and intelligent and belied his slow and rather cautious speech. And that's similar to, I guess, Evie, if that's what it is, where it is like, it's interesting because it's like they are, they're like, honest truth tellers. And I guess they're the good people who are not deceptive, because none of them are really strongly considered as suspects.
That's excellent. All right, you got the table slapping. Other comments?
I'm kind of coming at this from a novice. I remember seeing Murder on the Orient Express many years ago. I've never read a Poirot story before, so I only read the first 7 chapters, so I may be completely wrong about this. Seems like Poirot is really, to me, the only colorful character in the whole book so far, and that started making me think about other sort of colorful detectives, kind of quirky detectives that really capture your imagination. Holmes, obviously Poirot. Monk was a great TV show about an obsessive compulsive detective with germophobia who just was hysterically funny and a really good detective. Columbo, Jessica Fletcher, Father Brown, some of the great Japanese detective Galileo, who was actually a physics professor, just with this quirky sort of personality, this Inspector Imanishi, Kojak, and compare those to sort of the less colorful, more one-dimensional sorts of detectives like Mike Hammer, Sam Spade, Philip Marlowe, Nick Charles, even Nancy Drew, Dick Tracy. I mean, these sort of more, I don't know, one-dimensional, less quirky, character-driven, personality-driven detectives. I don't know. I got to say, I'm not a huge fan of Poirot so far. I really don't like his personality. I think he's kind of silly. He's sort of, in my mind, he's kind of an effeminate, little, silly man who, I hope I'm wrong. I hope when I finish this novel, I'll be my mind will be completely changed, and I hope that Agatha Christie is just sort of, she's gonna, completely change my course direction on this as the novel concludes. But as of right now, I just really don't like this individual. And I think there is some truth to the criticism that the characters are fairly pale. There's not much. I can't, you say, oh, there's John Cavendish and there's Lawrence Cavendish and there's this. I mean, who can tell the difference between any of these characters? Or so one was a lawyer, one was a detective, one was a doctor. Which one is which? It's not. They're not. I don't know. They just don't jump off the page at me. The only one who does jump off the page at me is Poirot, and I really don't like him. So,
but do you like the story and the mystery?
Do I like the mystery? Yeah. Well, so far I don't.
You have to watch the movie.
Yeah, because I'm a toxicologist. I'm a physician. I'm a poison specialist. So I know strychnine, and it's an interesting from that perspective. Yeah, I think it's interesting and the depiction of strychnine poisoning is very interesting and very accurate for the most part. But I am not a huge fan so far. I hope I get proven wrong. I hope we come back next week. I say, something, I was wrong. Agatha Christie is fantastic. She's much better than Conan Doyle. But
I
right now,
kind of agree with you. I don't really like, I don't remember who's who and what's what, but I'm just like, I can't wait to find out who did it and
Done it.
why and what. So it's like with Sherlock Holmes, it was more of a story. Whereas this, I'm like, ooh, yeah, like you were saying, Derek, it's like Clue, like what's happening, and you're following along with it.
She is saturating your brain, though. I mean, you guys are right. I mean, she's cooking you up where it's hard to figure this out. This is Clue, like Derek said. It's Colonel Mustard somewhere with a candlestick, and yeah.
Is this a fair play mystery? I mean, are all the clues there? That's one thing that you can criticize Conan Doyle about. I mean, many of the Sherlock Holmes stories were not fair play. There was sort of this Deus ex machina little twist at the end. Like, wait a minute, nobody could have figured that out.
Well,
That's
a
a
good question.
We have to wait
right?
till next week because we don't know.
That's a good question, though. Like, Ginny, when you were young and you had the Notebook, I mean, did you honestly solve some of these? I mean, I truly think, I mean, I've read a few Agathas, a few Conans over my life, but I mean, I'm always like, wait a second, I want to figure this out. But there's always, it's like, wait a second, they know more than we know as the reader, even as we move along and figure out things.
But they're also the red herring.
Right, but I
Right,
definitely picked the murder in some of them. I got them right. You know, and plus she's written, you know, if you read all 60 of them, you know, and really think about them, you eventually sort of get the idea that you will guess. You know, I wasn't right 100% of the time because there are red herrings. Sometimes I went down a path that was wrong. But I think the more you pay attention, and that's what I think is great about our books. It's not, you know, it's not like Dickens where you're so tied up in these characters that have so much going on in their lives and they seem so real to you. It's the mystery. It's the who did this? I need to know who did this. And I'm like, and I stopped. I didn't go all the way through to the end, so I wouldn't be thinking about, you know, who the murderer was, even though I read it ages ago. But I want to know. I can't wait till after tonight so I can go back and finish it now and quick find out who it was because I think I know who it is, but I'm not sure.
And
there seems to be a lot of red herrings in this book, although I know the end. But and there are a lot of clues that turn out to be bad clues, and I think really that was done on purpose just to make it harder for you to figure out the result. Right. It's not necessarily, I mean, it's not a straightforward thing. There's lots of, you know, it's like a labyrinth.
Or maybe like I keep thinking about is that history that we learned about Conan Doyle being like such a spiritualist last week. And so maybe it isn't just to lead us astray to different paths. Like maybe it's to demonstrate that this like weird, now I'm looking at this through this like completely spiritual like lens of like that these guys are really just supposed to vibrate on a different plane, able to like see through all this stuff.
You know, to me, I think I do the New York Times crossword every day, and as my colleague Mike Torrey at GA will say, that's because you're retired and you can do these things. But nevertheless, I do the New York Times crossword, and I'll tell you, on Monday and Tuesday, I feel so damn smart.
Yeah.
I just whip through that baby, you know, and then, you know, and it's kind of like, okay, so what if you figure out who done it early without the misclues? I mean, you know, today, I mean, you know, Monday's puzzle, 12 minutes. Today's puzzle, 22. By the time I get to Friday and Saturday, I'm looking like it's sort of like I might as well just bring breakfast with me, you know, and just eat it while I'm trying to do the damn puzzle. But it's sort of like, okay, what Christie is doing by putting down the clues that become so, well, we find irrelevant. She's pushing us towards the Thursday, Friday, Saturday times. Okay. And that in a way is what she was saying when she said this should be sort of a mental exercise. You know, we should have to, you know, essentially exercise our brains. to figure these things out. And even if we don't, the good thing is that we're doing the exercise,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
I made a list like the other gentleman, I forget his name. If you look at the TV shows today, does anybody watch Bosch or Trent?
Yeah. Yep.
Which I love. And I made an entire list from Murder, She Wrote and Moonlighting, which is back on Wild Card, Perry Mason, and all these shows. It's all about the story and trying to figure out who it is. But in Perry Mason, I mean, I'm sure you remember Jenny. You never knew who the bad guy was. They were always in the courtroom, but it was a surprise. So it doesn't. It's a journey, and the destination is fun. Only Columbo, do you know the outcome in the beginning, right? And I think Columbo is one of the best of all these guys. But Columbo does it backwards. But everything else, it's all a matter of the process and the journey. And all the destination is a dessert. You have to enjoy the journey. And if you don't enjoy the journey, then this isn't your genre that you like to partake in, I think.
Absolutely. And I'll tell you, when we get to Maisie Dobbs, you'll like the fact that she's just like Columbo. She's always got just one more question before she goes out the door. She's leaving and they put one more question. She's totally in the Columbo line of questioning. I think one of the other interesting things about this book that Agatha chose to do, like she threw a lot of things. This is her very first book. And she's not a novelist. She didn't grow up trying to be a novelist. She wrote this on a dare. Okay, so keep that in mind. She wrote this on a dare from her sister to pass the time. So it wasn't like she was some great author, cranking out volumes. When Doyle wrote Sherlock Holmes, he'd already had published stories, short stories, he'd written articles. This is just, I'm going to write this. So she's throwing in elements of Sherlock Holmes, she's grabbing stuff from different things. And she also chooses to go with the locked door mystery, that she's in this room poisoned and every door is locked. And I think that's another thing she pitches in there. She may be throwing the whole kitchen sink at us in this first one because it's her first attempt at writing a book. And let's face it didn't get taken right away. 6 publishers turned this down before she got it accepted. So it's not perfection yet for her. And as she goes on, she gets better and better. And with like Tommy and Tuppence and Miss Marple, she has lots of different types of detectives that work with her. But she also chose to throw in the locked room mystery. Every door is bolted. Who got in there to poison her and how did it happen?
I also think part of it could just be to, at least just from the literature I've read from this period in like the early 20s, maybe like later Bloomsbury group. I've personally have found like literature from this period, I struggle with like a lack of exposition and like a lack of world building. I'm thinking of Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. I think eventually you get the world building as the book progresses, but kind of at the beginning, it really just like throws you in. And so I'm trying to think of other books I've read from this period, but that's just my personal experience. So I don't know if that's just like I said, at that time in the 1920s.
Talking about exactly by world building.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Yeah, what exactly are you talking about world building?
I was referring more to like exposition. So thinking about
I think she said word building. What did you say? Word, not world? Or world?
World building.
Like okay, world building. Okay.
Like the atmosphere of the story, you mean?
Yeah, well, that and also like I'm thinking of just like the way that the characters get introduced and the way that the plot gets introduced. I just resonated with people's points earlier about kind of feeling a little lost and chaotic at the beginning and then kind of like eventually figuring it out. I've had a similar experience with other books I've read from this period. So I wasn't sure if maybe that was like the style. I also think Ms. Hoffman's point is super correct about like this is her first novel. She had like probably no clue what she was doing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think, but though I think she's also, it's not like she was ignorant of the tradition before, about the way other mysteries prior to hers were written. So I think, in terms of, you want, it's a huge difference between like the Victorian novel, where, you have like more exposition than you might want, right? And you move into the 20th century. You've got James Joyce, you want somebody who confuses and challenges, you've got him. So I think, yeah, I think you're right. It's partly her style or approach is partly a result of the time that she's writing. But I also think that she's quite aware. I mean, after all, she makes reference to Conan Doyle and Sherlock Holmes in this book, right? So she's aware of her predecessor.
She's read a great deal. She's very well read. I mean, she grew up, pretty much alone with her parents, and she did a lot of reading. So she is familiar, but this is her first attempt at writing something, and sending it out to be published. So you're right. She does know, she's read a wide range of novels, and is familiar with, and certainly was familiar with Holmes, and she put a lot of Holmes's elements into it. And then eventually develops, a whole slew of characters of her own that you follow through these books.
I think this is her intent. She wasn't trying to write the novel. She was writing a mystery story.
Sure.
And in the first 7 chapters, she's putting clues everywhere.
Yeah, exactly, Charles. Like, this book is a half-hour episode of a TV show where, like, Maisie, which I read already, that's a 8-episode binge series or like a Dickens-size novel.
Yeah, and she's got half your characters are suspects before you even start. Everybody's got a motive. And then the clues just add up, and she wasn't developing characters and stories. It was getting you set up for the clues.
I mean, what if you right now were totally sure of who the murderer was? How would you feel about yourself? First of all, how would you feel about yourself?
Why finish?
Question, how would you feel about the book?
Well, with the book, my feeling was it was the one person who looked so obvious it couldn't be him. Knowing how books work, that it would stop at the halfway point because there's nothing else to do. So you knew something had to change.
Okay. Other ideas about, like, Hillary? How would you feel?
Wait, sorry, I missed that. So there were people in the room. Things were happening. What was the question?
Listen, it's not the first time you've zoned out in a class of mine. All right, so.
Not fair.
I would want to know, like, why, if I already knew who, I would want to know why, or just there would be other aspects of the story. Whereas now I'm trying to figure out who did it. If I already knew who, there would be some other thing, right? There's always
if it's a good mystery, mystery, there has to be some other
Good
thing.
mystery, you want to finish it. Otherwise, you just put it down. If 5 pages in, you knew who did it, and there wasn't anything to it, you wouldn't keep reading it.
No, you wouldn't.
But you got to remember the Columbo type story.
Exactly.
Right, but his is all about how they did it. And that's the other piece you can be looking for, is not who did it, but how did they do it?
Yes.
And how does he get to how they did it?
Which is important in this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but she's writing to sell books. I mean, she's writing to be successful. I mean, the GA English class, you're going to read the 20th century American novelists, Fitzgerald, Faulkner, Hemingway. These are the great American novelists. But the 2 most successful novelists of the first half of the 20th century are Zane Grey and Edgar Rice Burroughs. I mean, they're writing books that the people are going to buy, and they became wealthy people. And I think Christie's the same. Christie's trying to write books that people enjoy and buy. And she was very successful in that. But to bring these classical critics to criticize her work and things like that is not fair. She's not a novelist. She's a pulp storyteller.
Now, did you want to respond to somebody whose finger is raised?
That's me. I wouldn't describe her as a pulp novelist, though. I feel like that's still doing her writing a disservice. That's just me.
Well, so is Alexander Dumas, who well,
there's nothing wrong with a pulp novelist.
Yeah, but this is her first one too.
Yeah,
she wasn't writing this book to make money. She wrote this book on a dare for something to do. She was bored. Her husband was away in the military. She was by herself, working the hospital. So when she wrote this first one, she was just trying to tell a story, and then, her sister didn't think she could do it, and she did, and she went to get it published. But you also have to take into account the time period that she got going with her books was right after World War I, and people were looking for a distraction and not something super heavy. They wanted to read something that took them away from all the troubles that they had, but also with little things they could relate about the war. So people reading this could relate about the Belgian refugees being in their town, and they could relate about being a voluntary aid detachment worker and being somebody like Hastings who was recovering, from the war. Let's face it, Britain lost a huge amount of their population in World War I. It was devastating to the general population. So her writing books that would appeal to people to make them have something to take their mind off, what life was like, which it wasn't really great in that period after the war. And of course, she wrote way, kept right on going once she got started.
Isn't that also when, like, correct me if I'm wrong, like Dadaism, like that movement in art and stuff started after the First World War? So it's kind of not surprising, or maybe in another way, a little surprising, that there would be this like tactile mystery, but also something that's like more leaning towards like absurd and farther away from like things that are like right and true and moral and stuff.
You bring up an interesting thing, because it's always a big question in mysteries about the morality factor, and that's something probably we can, keep in mind in the following weeks. But
you are correct about Dadaism. I just looked it up, and it was in reaction to the First World War. Bonus points for you.
All right, it's a table slap. Okay,
She does, and it is 8:17, so we should be wrapping things up ready for our conclusion next week of this mystery.
Fun, right? Yeah,
I know we're having a good time here, but we need to stay on track for people.